We're continuing our series today on the unconventional Jesus. This is not the Jesus of Sunday school, not the Jesus of that famous picture that we all know of Jesus with the perfectly coiffed hair and the blue eyes. Looks like he never had a bad day in his life. That's not the real Jesus. That might be the conventional picture of Jesus. And unfortunately, that picture is still copyrighted, so I can't show it as part of the sermon today. But if you Google picture of Jesus, you know the picture that I'm talking about, and you could find it. But that's not the Jesus of the New Testament. That's not the Jesus of first century Palestine who walked around ministering to people and stirring things up. Jesus was unconventional. And last week we talked about the unconventional temptation of Jesus, that when Jesus was tempted in the desert, that this was not a temptation to do something bad. Although, yes, Satan did say, "Worship me, and all the kingdoms will be yours." And worshiping Satan is obviously something that Jesus isn't going to do, something that's wrong. But the goal for Jesus to rule over all the kingdoms of the world, that is indeed where Jesus is going to be. But Jesus was unconventional. He wasn't just going to take over. He wasn't just going to seize power. He was going to go the way of the cross. That he would gain his authority. He would gain the power over the whole world, not by compelling people, but by loving people, by inviting people into the new reality that he was creating. And one of the things about Jesus, that this new way, it made him look like a fool. Now I know that's something that is a dangerous thing to say, that Jesus was a fool. But if you look at the New Testament, if you read the stories about Jesus, he is not what people expected. He was not the conventional prophet, right? He was not John the Baptist. John the Baptist came and he looked like a prophet. He was out in the desert. He dressed in camel's hair. He ate locusts. He was an ascetic. He fasted. He preached against the powers that be. And people said, "Look, John the Baptist, he has a demon." And Jesus, when Jesus came into the world, Jesus was not an ascetic, right? He did not renounce the world. Granted, there is that story from last week, the story of the temptation in the desert, where Jesus fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. So there is a place for asceticism in Jesus' life, and thus in our lives. And we can talk about that sometime. But Jesus did not renounce everything. Because what people said about Jesus is, "Look, there is a glutton and a drunkard, somebody who hangs out with tax collectors and prostitutes and sinners." And in their minds, in that world, that would be a fool. If you look at the book of Proverbs, the fool is one who hangs out with the wrong people. The fool is one who eats and drinks too much. That's a fool. And so people were saying Jesus is a fool. He's a fool for hanging out with these people. He's a fool for fitting in with their culture. He's a fool for not taking them to task for doing things that were unacceptable and disapproved by the powers that be, by the religious and political authorities. Jesus was a fool, but he was an unconventional fool. His foolishness challenged those in power by accepting those people that were outcasts, by saying that they were welcomed into God's family, that they were, in fact, on their way into the kingdom of God. And Jesus put it this way, he said, "The prostitutes and tax collectors, you Pharisees, the prostitutes and tax collectors will enter the kingdom of God before you." they're going to make it in first. And people would have said, that is foolish. The people who are following the rules, the people who are being religiously observant, everybody would say, those are the people that will enter into God's kingdom first. And Jesus said, no, you have it completely wrong. It's not about following the rules. It's not about executing all of the proper religious rituals. It's about trusting in the God of mercy. It's about accepting God's love. It's about being transformed into the image of the loving God. That's what it's about. And people thought that was foolish. People thought that the stories, a lot of the stories that Jesus told, they thought they were foolish. And think about it. One of his most famous stories, the story of the 100 sheep. You all know this story. Jesus says, if you had 100 sheep out in the wilderness, and one of them goes off by itself, wanders off, and you don't know where it is, he says, who wouldn't leave the 99 in the wilderness and go off to find that one poor, confused, stupid sheep? And you know what the answer is. The answer is, of course, no one would do that. Why would you leave 99 relatively intelligent sheep that at least have enough sense to stick together and go off to try to find the one sheep that couldn't keep it together? Leave those 99 to be eaten or attacked by bears or wolves and go off to find that one? No, no one would do that. That is foolish. And yet Jesus says that that is precisely the nature of God. That God is always going out to seek and save people who have wandered far from God. That's the nature of God. That's the nature of God's love. And then he tells an even sillier story, which is even more famous, this story that we call the story of the prodigal son. And Jesus says, basically, God is like a father that would welcome his son home, even after his son took his inheritance while the father was still alive, which would be unheard of in that culture. You would never do that. That would never happen. And goes and wastes it all. He wastes a huge portion of his father's estate. And that father welcomes the son back and puts a ring on his finger and a robe on his back and sandals on his feet, saying, yes, you are still my son. You are beloved. That is foolish. And Jesus says that is precisely what God is like. That kind of radical acceptance. That kind of radical love. And of course, Jesus' entire life, from the perspective of those people in authority, from those people who were the political and religious rulers, was foolish. It challenged them, but it was foolish. When he comes riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, what conquering king comes riding on a donkey? This is a parody. It's foolish. But in that foolishness, Jesus challenges everything about that system. He challenges their power. He challenges their violence. He challenges their perception that they really are in control. And says, no, you're really not. And of course, the ultimate foolishness is Jesus, the Son of God, God incarnate, going to the cross. And St. Paul in one of our readings today points out that the cross does seem foolish to people. Now to us, the cross is salvation and life. The cross is the clearest example of God showing love for us. But for people in the early days of the church, for people who were looking at Christianity, it seemed pretty silly that God, the creator of all, would come down to earth and take on human form and then be crucified, die the most humiliating death ever. That was just too much. That was foolish. I want to show you a piece of early graffiti. You can see this. There's the cross, and you can see that the figure on the cross has a donkey's head. And the caption says, Aleximos worships his God. Somebody was picking on Aleximos, but somebody was also picking on Jesus. That this man who died on the cross was a fool. And perhaps the only people that were more foolish were the ones that worshipped him. But see, God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom. That Jesus going to the cross and showing that God would take the worst that humanity had to offer, that God would not lash out in anger, that God would not condemn in judgment, but that God would take that evil, God would absorb that violence, and God would forgive. Jesus' words from the cross, Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. Forgiveness, mercy, grace. Now, some would say that that's foolishness. But it is a foolishness that really is wiser than the best of human wisdom. For how can reconciliation happen? How can people come together? How can people be reconnected with God without mercy, without grace, without a God who just gives and loves? Some people would call that foolish, but we call it a foolishness that is far better than any wisdom that the world has to offer. Thanks be to God.